Hi, I'm Donna Warren, a professor of philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and I love argument mapping. As you can see, I'm wearing my purple t-shirt. I'm wearing my purple t-shirt because I went to commencement today, and purple is one of our school colors. Commencement, of course, is a ceremony at which we welcome our new students to campus. It's a very exciting ceremony, and I thought, as long as we're thinking about starting new things, as long as I'm wearing my purple t-shirt, maybe I can start to record some very short videos about argument mapping. Maybe I can post them on YouTube, and maybe some people will find them interesting or helpful. I've never done this before, so please forgive me if I'm not doing this properly, if the lighting's not right, if the sound isn't good. I just basically want to talk a little bit about argument mapping. So, what is it? Well, first of all, what's an argument? When I talk about an argument, I'm not going to mean a dispute or a fight. I'm going to mean a unit of reasoning that attempts to show that one idea is true by citing other ideas as evidence. Now, sometimes we also consider ideas that are not cited as evidence, but that are cited as objections to a claim or refutations to the objections to a claim. I'm not going to worry about that right now, because I think if we really understand arguments as those chains of evidence, we can easily understand objections and rebuttals later on if we want to. So that's what an argument is. A unit of reasoning that attempts to establish that one idea is true by citing other ideas as evidence. For example, suppose that we're wondering whether my neighbors are home. I could say, yes, my neighbors are home because the lights are on. There, I'm trying to establish that my neighbors are home, and I'm establishing it by citing this other claim, the claim that the lights are on. I could also attempt to establish that my neighbors are at home by saying, yes, I know my neighbors are at home because their dog is in the backyard, and when they're not at home, the dog is always kept inside. So there, it's a little more complicated. I'm establishing the same claim that my neighbors are at home by citing two claims this time. The claim that the dog is in the backyard, and the claim that whenever they are not at home, the dog's kept inside. I could also say my neighbors are at home because I hear them working on the house, and because their car's in the driveway. That's another argument for the same claim. Now, the thing about arguments is they have internal structure. The thing about arguments is they have an internal structure. Our ideas in arguments, I'm just thinking about two ideas here. Two ideas in an argument are related to each other in one of only three ways. And we've actually seen all of those three ways already. The first way that two ideas can be related to each other in an argument is one idea is being given as a reason to believe the other idea. Now, sometimes when I move my hands like this, you can tell that I'm always thinking of the bottom idea as being the idea that is supported by the top idea. That's just because that's the orientation that I use. There's nothing magic about it. We could also, if we prefer, think about the idea that I'm trying to establish as being out here on the right, and the evidence for it being out here on the left, or we could think of the idea that we're trying to establish as being on top, and the ideas that support it as being on the bottom. The orientation is completely arbitrary. I can't think of any good reason why we should have the conclusion at the top, bottom, or on the side. I'm just going to talk about it on the bottom. Okay, so two ideas can be related to each other as evidence, conclusion. Like, I know my neighbors are at home because reasons. I can see their lights on, right? So I can see their lights on, so I know they're at home. That's one way that two ideas can be related to each other. Notice that I said it in two different ways. First, I said, my neighbors are at home because the lights are on. I also said, the lights are on, so I know my neighbors are at home. I can express it in different ways. The first time I used because, the second time I used so. These are sometimes called inference indicator expressions. We might talk about that later on if we want to. Right now, important point, that's one way that two ideas can be related to each other, right? Another way we've also seen two ideas can be related to each other because they work together to establish a third idea. For example, I know my neighbors are at home because their dog is in the backyard, and whenever they are gone, the dog stays inside. Again, the dog is in the backyard. Whenever they're not at home, the dog stays inside, so they must be home. Whenever they're not at home, the dog stays inside, so they must be home, right? Just think about these two ideas, the ones about the dog. The dog's outside. Whenever they are not at home, the dog stays inside. Those two ideas work together to establish the third idea. See? So that's the second way ideas can work together. First way, they can have an inference between them, or that's just a fancy way of saying one idea is being given as a reason to believe the other. Second way, two ideas can work together, sort of in a linked way. They need each other to establish the truth of a third idea. And the third way the two ideas can be related to each other is they're really not related to each other. They are each given as an independent reason to establish a third idea. So they kind of go separately. For instance, I might say, I know my neighbors are at home because I can hear my neighbor working on the house, and because their car is in the driveway. Now compare these two ideas. I hear my neighbor working on the house, and their car is in the driveway. You see how different they are than the two ideas about the dog? The dog's outside, and the dog is only outside if they're home, or whenever they're not home, the dog is inside. Those two ideas need to work together. This idea about I can hear my neighbor working on the house and their car is in the driveway, they don't work together in the same way, but they both work independently on their own to establish this other idea. Okay? In case you can't tell, I like gestures. So those are the only three ways the two ideas can be related to each other. With an inference in between them, they can be connected, they can work together, or they can work independently, right? One idea given reason to believe another, two ideas working together, two ideas working independently. That's it. So what that tells us is arguments have structure. Arguments have internal structure. Normally, arguments are presented in prose. They're just sort of talked at you, someone just expresses them to you verbally, or they're presented to you in a letter to the editor, in a textbook, in some sort of narrative form, right? The thing about prose, whether it's written or spoken, is there's not a lot of internal structure to prose as prose. Prose starts, it goes, prose ends. That's it. So what we have, if we just represent arguments in standard prose, which is how most people represent arguments, is we have something that has structure being represented in a medium that obscures that structure, right? Because there's not structure in prose. That's why arguments can be difficult to understand. The wonderful thing about argument mapping, the really wonderful thing, is it graphically displays that argument structure. And I kind of even alluded to how it works, right? When I did the argument, when I gave the hand gestures. One idea on top of another with an arrow between them shows that this idea is being given as a reason to believe that idea. Two ideas next to each other with the plus between them shows that these two ideas work together to establish a third. Two ideas, each with their own arrow to the third idea, shows that those two ideas don't work together to establish the third. And that's it. Now, of course, it can get more complicated than that, because you can have ideas being given as a reason to believe another idea, which is then added to a third, right? Which might come from some other idea. So the arguments themselves can get, rather complex, and their structure can show that. But that's fine, right? Because complex structures can be built out of just those three patterns. That is it. And an argument map, unlike prose, visually displays that structure. That's why I love argument mapping. I think it's aesthetically wonderful. I think it's fun to think about, and it helps me to think more clearly. Thanks a lot. This was kind of fun. I might do it again. Bye-bye.